A dark and largely unknown tale of demonic possession was recounted in an anonymous pamphlet from 1584, and was said to have involved a terrifying headless bear. The pamphlet, entitled A True and Most Dreadful Discourse of a Woman Possessed with the Devil at Ditchit in Somersetshire, a matter as miraculous as ever was seen in our time, revealed a strange and disturbing incident. It told the story of one Margaret Cooper who exhibited symptoms of demonic possession such as foaming at the mouth, but, even more bizarrely, it described her assault by a headless bear. The unseen attacker was said to have bent her into the shape of a hoop and rolled her around the house. The bear was only driven away by the invocation of the Holy Trinity, according to the odd document. It appears that the headless bear trope continued for some time, for in 1614 another pamphlet called A Miracle of Miracles, as fearful as ever was seen or heard in the memory of man, told a similar tale about a bear attack taking place in 1613 or 1614. And another pamphlet, this time in 1641, and called Most Fearful and Strange News from the Bishopric of Durham, being a true relation one Margaret Hooper, note the name change from Cooper to Hooper, placed the incident at a different time and location. The pamphlet seemed to be telling the terrifying tale as a kind of parable, rather than a truthful historical event aimed at encouraging religious devotion in a superstitious population. The original pamphlet listed a series of alleged witnesses to the event, but these cannot be credibly verified. The notion of the headless bear was reasonably well worn in early modern England, with the historian John Fox alluding to it in his work Acts and Monuments in 1583. In it he referenced a man named William Webb, who set the image of a headless bear in the tabernacle of St. Roque. It seems bears, which were extinct in England by this time, were associated with the diabolical. Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, performed in 1592, features the devil Belial assuming the shape of a bear. And in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, the fairy Puck describes taking the shape of a hog, a headless bear, sometime a fire. The preface to Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy of 1621 includes the lines, "My fantasy presents 1,000 ugly shapes, headless bears." And again in 1691, Richard Baxter's book, The Certainty of the World of Spirits, includes the lines, "Simon Jones, a strong and healthful man of Kedderminster, no way inclined to melancholy or any fancies, hath oft told me that being a soldier of the king in the war against the Parliament, in a clear moonshine night as he stood sentinel in the College Green at Worcester, something like a headless bear appeared to him, and so affrighted him, that he laid down his arms soon after and returned home to his trade. And while I was there, afterward, which was 14 years, lived honestly, religiously, and without blame, and I think is yet living, which mindeth me of that which followeth, though to me not known." Turning to the original tale, it read, "Upon the 9th day of May last past, anno 1584, there was a man of honest reputation dwelling in the town of Ditchit, which is about 3 miles off Bruton, the most ancient town within Somersetshire, whose name is Stephen Cooper, a man of good wealth and well beloved of his neighbours, who being sick and living in a weak state sent his wife, whose name was Margaret Cooper, upon the 9th day of May last past into Gloucestershire, to take order concerning a farm which he hath in a village called Rockhampton, alias Rockington, at whose coming thither it seems all things were not according to her mind. Thus continuing there one day and something more, she returned home to her husband, partly aggrieved at such changes as she thought her husband might reform if God lent him life. Now when she was come home again to Ditchit, she found her husband recovered to an indifferent health, to whom she began to use much idle talk, as well as concerning the same farm, as also concerning an old groat which her son, being a little boy, had found about 1 week before. Thus she continued, as it were one that had been bewitched or harried with some evil spirit, until Tuesday at night following, which night she took her rest something indifferently until towards the morning, at which time she began with much vain speech to disquiet her husband, and to use much idle talk, but her husband, seeing her in such a mind, and finding she was not as it were one that were desperate, he persuaded her to call upon God, and that being the creature of God she should not forget to call upon her Creator in the day of trouble. Wherefore he counselled her to pray with him, and to say the Lord's Prayer after him, which she partly did. But the pamphlet reveals how the devil makes Mrs. Cooper withdraw from prayer, and yearn for the mysterious groat, a kind of old coin, as well as her wedding ring. The story continues, her husband made no great haste thereunto, but continued in prayer, that it would please God to send her a more quiet spirit, and to strengthen her, that faith might speedily vanquish such vanity in her. But the more he praised and persuaded her to praise, the more she seemed to be, as it were, troubled with some evil spirit, calling still for the old groat which her husband neglected to show her. Whereat she began with a very stern and staring countenance to look on her husband in most wonderful sort, as that he was sore frightened with the same. For those struggling with the antiquated language here, the wife becomes even more desperate to see the coin and stares in a terrifying way at her husband. And it was then that all hell began to break loose. He called for her brother and sister to help restrain her in bed as she thrashed around violently before foaming at the mouth. She shook with such force that the bed and the chamber did shake and move in most strange sort. Her husband continued praying for her deliverance, so that within 1/2 hour after her shaking was left, she began to tell them that she had been in town to beat away the bear which had followed her into the yard when she came out of the country, which to her thinking had no head. Then her husband and friends persuaded her to leave those vain imaginations, persuading her that it was nothing but the lightness of her brain which was become idle for want of rest. Wherefore her husband and friends persuaded her to say the Lord's Prayer with them, which she did, and after took some small rest, and thus they remained until the Sunday following, in which time she continued raging, as if it were distraught of her memory, which came by fits to the great grief of her husband, friends, and neighbours. After that, Margaret Cooper seemed to be recovering, but then at midnight on the Sunday her candle burned out, leading her to cry for help. She later said to her husband, "Do you not see the devil?" The pamphlet adds, whereat they desired her to remember God and call for grace, that her faith might be only fixed upon him to the vanquishing of the devil and his assaults. The wife warns her husband that he will see something soon enough, and a terrible noise is heard in the street as loud as 2 or 3 carts. Those gathered in the bedchamber were then said to have cried out, saying, "Lord help us, what manner of thing is this that cometh here?" Then her husband, looking up in his bed, espied a thing come to the bed, much like unto a bear, that it had no head or no tail, 1/2 yard in length and 1/2 yard in height. Her husband, seeing it come up to the bed, rose up and took a joined stool and struck at the said thing. The stroke sounded as though he had broken upon a feather bed. Then it came to the woman and struck her 3 times upon her feet, and took her out of the bed, and so rolled her to and fro in the chamber and under the bed. The people there present, to the number of 7 persons, were so greatly amazed with this horrible sight that they knew not what to do, yet they still called upon God for his assistance. But then the candle was so dim that they could scarcely see one another. At the last this monster, which we suppose to be the devil, did thrust the woman's head between her legs, and so rolled her in a round compass like a hoop through 3 other chambers, down a high pair of stairs in the hall, where he kept her the space of 1/4 of an hour. Her husband and they in the chamber above dared not even come down to her, but remained in prayer, weeping at the stairs head, grievously lamenting to see her so carried away. There was such an horrible stink in the hall, and such fiery flames, that they were glad to stop their noses with cloths and napkins. Then the woman cried out, calling to her husband. "Now he is gone. Then," quoth he, "in the name of God, come up to me." And so even upon the sudden she was come so quickly that they greatly marvelled at it. Then they brought her to bed, and 4 of them kept down the clothes about the bed and continued in prayer for her. The candle in the chamber could not burn clear, but was very dim, and suddenly the woman was got out of bed, and the window at the bed's head opened. Whether the woman did unpin the window, or how it cameth to pass, they knew not, but it was opened, and the woman's legs, after a marvellous manner, thrust out at the window, so they were clasped about the post in the middle of the window between her legs. Then the gathered throng saw a great fire that stunk, and heard something knocking at Mrs. Cooper's feet like the sound of a tub being hit. They continued in frantic prayer, charging the devil in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost to depart from the woman. They then laid hands on her and cried to the Lord to help them in their great need, and so pulled her in again and set her upon her feet. Then she looked out at a window and began to say, "O Lord," quoth she, "methinks I see a little child," but they gave no regard to her. Mrs. Cooper repeated the claim 2 or 3 times, until at last they looked out of the window and saw something that appeared childlike, with a very bright countenance. They were then said to have fallen flat to the ground and praised the Lord that he had so wonderfully assisted them, and the child vanished away. This marked the start of Mrs. Cooper's recovery, and the tale says how she asked for God's forgiveness and admitted that her sins had led to her torment at the hands of the evil spirit. The pamphlet concludes by listing the names of the supposed witnesses. What this story does is highlight some of the key features of demonic possession as it would have been understood at the time, with the addition of the contemporary horror trope of the headless bear, of course. It also features the intervention of a divine being in the form of a child. Was this an angel? It is a strange tale from a time of great credulity, where the belief in the veritable bestiary of bogeymen was commonplace. Did the story owe some of its origins to the earlier alleged fantastical monsters from antiquity known as the Acephaloi or Blemmies, who it was said were inhabitants of ancient Libya? These odd humanoid creatures had no heads on their shoulders and faces on their chests. Or were they a distant reminder of 8 feet tall headless islanders in the Anglo-Saxon wonders of the East? Whatever their origins, it seems headless antagonists were the stuff of nightmares for our forebears, if you pardon the pun, for centuries. One modern explanation claims that these creatures could have been an erroneous description of great apes, whose slouched appearance and lowered heads, parallel with their shoulders, could have given rise to the mythical beings from far-flung locations. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and most importantly subscribe. And you can also support the channel on Subscribestar via the link in the description, or via YouTube Super Thanks. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.